So the first one, in case I think I mentioned this to you guys, but you can totally turn off the sky dome in a render. So I'm actually just going to really quick set my project to that mash play folder because I have some like cruddy textures stashed in there. And by cruddy textures, I mostly mean, you know, a background, which I will use. So I'm gonna, oop, not very light. So if you guys are ever using a sky dome light and it's like perfect thing ever for your lighting, but it's rendering really grainy or it just like doesn't make sense as a background for whatever you're trying to actually make, you can just turn that off in the renders. So again, here's render. If I want to turn off the sky dome light, I'm just going to select the sky dome light, scroll down, and under visibility, under the, if you see this like little camera slider, just turn that all the way down. It's going to stop rendering the HDRI. Practically speaking, for your assignments, be aware that I would consider this to be my avoid. So if you do this, please like put something behind your renders. But if you look at the alpha channel, you can see that like the plane and the sphere are rendered. There's just nothing here. So if you say this is like a PNG or something with transparency, you could really easily just like throw this on top of something else. So again, practically speaking, for your finals, if you have, you know, light coming through a window or something like that, and you want to substitute in a different background, you can just turn your HDRI off in the renders, and then just throw your image over whatever, you know, window scenery you want, and call it a day. But yeah, any questions on that? All right, that one was like fairly straightforward. And you guys are fortunate enough where I got portal lights working last week, so I'm not going to re-go over that again. Does anyone have questions about portal lights? All right. Unless I get specific questions, shrugs. Just, again, I would recommend if you're using Arnold to use them, because they tend to make renders slightly less noisy, and samply if you are lighting an indoor scene with an HDRI. And honestly, this is like one of the few times where something happens faster and better at the same time. Take advantage of that. Anywho, other miscellaneous bit, if you are so inclined and you are looking to render pixel art in Arnold, there's kind of a silly, hacky way to do that. It also renders super fast. So here's my little ball. This would be a little bit nicer looking demo on like a human figure, but if you go into your render settings and just turn the anti-aliasing on the camera down, you'll notice that it'll just stop rendering progressively grainier. So you can set this down to like, you know, -3, -5. Every time I go down to -10, it pretty much just becomes horrible. But again, if you're ever looking to do like weird little pixel arts or something like that, you can totally do that. So I'm just gonna like turn off my background, and then you could literally just render this out and use it as a very bad looking little ball sprite. But you could also do this if you had like an animated figure or something like that, just like render them out pretty simply. I don't know, just kind of thought it was cool. Any questions on that? All right. Cool, cool. There's a dumb thing. All right, and I think the only two other things that I want to go over is basically just, the first one is just like how to make cheap terrain, in case I haven't gone over that before. If you guys are, you know, doing anything where you can like see outside of your space and there's like a grassy field or something like that, you can use this technique to fairly easily make ground. At some point I will want this on. All right. So the first thing that you can do, which is probably like the grossest, least user-friendly way, or like least efficient way to do things, depending on what you want. I just have this super dense plane. I'm just going to grab a face, use B to turn on soft select, and if you hold down the B button and middle mouse button and drag, you can adjust the radius of that soft select without going into your settings. And then you can literally just like manually punch in hills and valleys, and it's not a terribly efficient way to do things. If you just need like a really simple shape like this, it works fine. If you need something more specific, like this would be an absolute nightmare to do. So the other thing that I usually end up doing, and this works really nicely, again, if you're just doing a little bit of, like a little field with a little bit of variation in it, you can use this to make fake water, is just using a texture deformer and applying, once that comes up, just applying a little noise map into the texture. So again, just noise map. You can see I now have a super lumpy ground. In this case, it maybe looks a little bit aggressive, so you can, play with the settings of your noise texture a little bit to kind of modify how that looks. But even if you're doing something, if you're ever doing, like a mulch bed or something like that, something that's like slightly textured but not super aggressively textured, you could do something like this to it, and it would give it a little bit of variation and visual interest without taking up a lot of time. So that's one thing you can do. You can also, if anyone ever wants to like put their face on a plane, you can use image files for this, not just noise textures. Other weird thing I happened to notice the other day is I found like a really nice height map of the world. So if you ever needed to make either a globe, or you're into like tabletop gaming and wanted to 3D print your own custom terrain, you could draw your own terrain maps and then basically just apply them to a texture and have instantly modeled ground. So in my little Mash Play folder, I have this, like, you can see it's like a weird texture map, or a height map pretty much of Earth. So as soon as I apply that, it'll lag for a second and then turn on, and now I have scary spiky Earth. Quick note, if you guys are ever doing texture deformers, like right now this is looking kind of ridiculous where like everything is stretching directly upwards. It's causing mesh issues here. Antarctica is being sucked into the core of the Earth. There's a weird setting that you have to choose if you're putting a texture deformer on like a 3D object rather than a plane. So if I just go into my texture deformer, you want to change direction. By default, it's set to handle, which is pretty much just looking at whatever the y-axis is on this little like move handle down here. You want to set that to normal. And you can see that as soon as I do that, like Antarctica pops back out, everything is kind of facing directly out from the globe. That's going to orient the shift in the mesh along the normal of each face, or perpendicular to each face, and kind of make it look more like what you expect from this. But now we have a very, very awkward little textured globe, if you need that. So that's pretty much just like sketchy fake ground and texture deformers. Any questions on that? All right, cool. And then I think the only other thing that I really have to go over is I just want to show you guys a really quick way to feather your ground planes if you ever need to, for one, like blend something into an HDRI a little bit better, or if you're ever just looking to make a decent effect, and like kind of make something look a little bit more polished towards the edges of a scene. So by default we have this. I'm actually going to turn my HDR back on. All right, so assuming that I wanted to sort of blend this ground plane into the grass a little bit, I'm just going to assign this a new material. Arnold, huzzah. I'm just going to grab like a quick sketchy little color map of the grass and make this super rough and not at all shiny. I basically just recreated a Lambert with a other texture because it's easy to see. So this, I mean, apart from the shadow shining completely off the edge of this plane, it's really, really obvious like where the seam in this is. And if you guys are, again, ever rendering an object like on a little grass plane, and then you have a grassy HDRI under it, you can use this technique to kind of feather it in and make your overall thing look a little more polished. And basically to do that, I'm just going to turn this entire thing into a card. So I'm just going to go down to my geometry tab, hit opacity, and you can make like a custom texture in Photoshop if you wanted specific detail. I'm just going to show you how to do it with like a weird little ramp shader. So I'm going to grab a ramp, and this is probably going to look real sketchy. And for one, nothing's happening, and that is because I need to tell Arnold that this is opaque. And clearly this is set up not well because this is the opposite effect of what I wanted. So first thing I'm going to do is go into my ramp and, so basically I can, control this ramp and slide the sliders around to control where this thing is opaque. I don't want V ramp, I don't want U ramp. In this case, you can use either a circular ramp, which is basically kind of like a really soft brush in Photoshop, more or less, You can also use a box ramp if you just want it to be like the actual edges of the square itself. Basically just kind of like fiddle around until you get the effect you want, but this is the opposite effect of what I want. But you can basically do something like this, and you can see that this edge over here has like really, I mean, it's still really obvious where the shadow cuts off, but it is blending a little bit nicer into the ground because of that slow fall off on the edge of the plane. So that's one thing you can do with a ramp shader. If I wanted to, you can also put in a noise texture to help sort of break up the texture and camouflage it seem a little bit more. And one thing I really enjoy about ramp shaders is you can map other, like I could map a file texture into one of the colors on a ramp shader. You can map other ramp shaders into a ramp shader. Noise textures, like it's really ridiculous. So in this case, I'm just gonna make another little color tab here, and I'm just gonna throw a noise texture in there. And you can see, especially around the rocky areas, you can see where it's like really sort of eating into the edge of that plane there and kind of just like helping to blend that out a little bit more. So this is something that I would encourage you guys to do, again, especially if you're ever like rendering something over an HDRI and you don't want to see that hard background there. Or if you're just making a standalone scene for something like Sketchfab and you have a ground plane that's a square, you can break it up a little bit and make it look more integrated with your floating scene. But that's pretty much that. Anyone have any questions on that? All right, cool. Great, I think that is, does anybody want a review on portal lights? All right, I think I asked that 10 seconds ago. All right, so if that's the case, next thing I have to go over is MASH.